Assalamu alaikum and welcome back to Just Law on IQRA TV. I'm your host Ilyas Bulbulia. This is the second part to the show. Just before the break, we were looking at how to make a successful spouse application, and I was taking our viewers through what the essential documents were that you needed to collate from the applicant who would normally be abroad. And we had been looking at the English certificate that you need to collate, and we'd also looked at the TB certificate and the importance of making sure that both those documents were within the validity date. So the other document that we need to look at and this is something that we need to obtain from the applicant who's normally abroad, is the marriage certificate. Now, on the marriage certificate, the real issue, I should say, in relation to the marriage, before we even get to the certificate, is that the marriage has to be performed and undertaken in accordance with what the law is in the country where the marriage takes place. So, for example, let's take Pakistan as an example. So, in Pakistan, if there's a difference between marriages which take place outside Azad Kashmir and within Azad Kashmir. So whatever the rules are related to marriages in the area where you are, those are the rules that you need to comply with. So the marriage has to take place in accordance with the rules there, and whatever official documentation you're able to obtain in relation to the marriage, you need to obtain that as well. So for example, let's say in India, where somebody has an Islamic marriage and they simply have the marriage performed at a masjid. Now, obviously, as far as we're concerned, as far as Muslims are concerned, that is a valid marriage under Islamic law. But that doesn't necessarily comply with the requirements of what you need to do with marriages under Indian law. Marriages have to be registered with the local registry office. That wasn't the case approximately 10 years ago, but even now, now the law has changed, and there is now an absolute requirement for marriages to be registered. So in the example we were talking about, it's not sufficient simply to say, well, we conducted the marriage at a masjid, here's the Islamic marriage certificate. That's not sufficient, because the law of the land there, the law in India stipulates that the marriage has to be registered. So when the application for a spouse visa is made, the key document isn't necessarily the marriage certificate from the mosque. The key document is the registration certificate, which complies with Indian law. Now, so whichever country it is, whether it's India, Pakistan, whether it's America, Dubai, wherever, Turkey, wherever it is, if the marriage takes place there, then whatever the rules, whatever the procedures are for making the marriage official, shall we say, those rules and procedures have to be followed and the proper marriage certificate obtained. So that's the key thing to remember as far as marriages are concerned. Now, the other normal issue that we come across is where the marriage is a second marriage. Now, it may be a second marriage for the applicant who's abroad, it may be a second marriage for the sponsor in the United Kingdom. But the key point where the marriage is a second marriage is that the first marriage, the first relationship needs to have been brought to an end properly, officially. And that's something we'll look at after we've taken our next call. Hello.
Hello, assalamu alaikum.
Walaikum salam. Ji, thank you for calling. Ji bhai, what's your question?
हाँ जी, मैं रिजवान बात कर रहा हूँ. couple of weeks back मैंने आपसे बात की थी.
जी रिजवान भाई जी.
मैंने वो सिस्टर का वीज़ा अप्लाई करवाया, फिर वो अपील का ना डॉक्यूमेंट भेज के. जी, ओके. जी, तो उन्होंने तो अपील को कंसीडर ही नहीं किया, ना ही उन्होंने डॉक्यूमेंट में मेंशन किया कि उन्होंने अपील को देखा है. जी. So, just need advice to see what I should do now. Because
Rizwan bhai, I remember, because you told me that you'd been to an appeal, and although, if my recollection is correct, although the appeal wasn't successful, the judge said a lot of helpful things at the appeal, didn't he?
जी. this one, yeah.
बिल्कुल उसने, have they not even considered any of the remarks made by the judge?
No, they're not even, they said again the same thing, you know, in the refusal letter, what they said in the last time. And they not even mention about, you know, the appeal. And they said, we look at your covering letter, but they not mention anything about the appeal.
So appeal mein, did you, okay, Rizwan, did you send them a copy of the appeal? Did you send them a copy of the decision? Definitely, yeah.
We did highlight, you know, those sections, but he not even mentioned anything.
All right, okay. Now, obviously, second time doing a visitor appeal is there's no point because जैसे आपको पता है कि appeal में तो you can't succeed. My view is you should now give serious consideration to whether you should judicially review the decision. Or clearly मुझको, I haven't seen the decision, I accept that, but आपने जो बात की इससे मुझको लगता है कि one of the issues will be कि the determination of the tribunal was a relevant document that the entry clearance officer should have looked at. When he looks at everything else, you know, when he looks at income documents and when he looks at property documents and
he does accept, you know, myself again, I can afford it.
So then he looks at your documents. So in the same way, he should have looked at the tribunal determination as well. That is something, even if he was going to say, look, I've looked at the tribunal determination, but I don't agree with it for X, Y, and Z. Okay, that's fine. But he must look at it. I think my view is he must look at it. So I think you should give serious consideration to judicially reviewing the.
I would like to, you know, send all the information to you to see if you can kindly have a look. But obviously, I need your details, you know, like so I can have a private chat with you.
No problem, no problem.
And I can personally have a, you know, have a discuss the case with you, one to one.
Okay, no problem. I think it might be easier if you get all the documents in some kind of order. Okay.
Yeah.
So in terms of, you know, the first application that was made, what you submitted to the tribunal when you went to the tribunal determination, and the documents for this second application as well.
Yeah, in terms of what was submitted. I got, you know, all the determinations, all, you know, the paperwork. I got a proper file ready, but, you know, I'm trying to get the number there, but I couldn't. I sent an email, but I couldn't get anything.
Okay, because I think what we need, you should really look at this stage is looking at not an appeal, but a judicial review of the decision based on the fact that I think there's a relevant document. The document is the decision of the judge in the visitor appeal that the entry clearance officer should have taken into account. I think my view is he should have taken that into account. He could have looked at it and said, I don't agree with it, but I think that's a relevant document he should have taken into account. So let's look at it on that basis. Now, in terms of maybe the best way is once this call is finished, if you call again, you should be able to get my number from the control room. They maybe just leave you my mobile number, but if you get the number after this call has ended, and then we'll have a discussion then. Thank you very much. We'll take our next call. Hello, assalamu alaikum.
Walaikum salam.
Ji.
I own a limited company.
All right.
And my salary is about £9,000 a year.
Okay.
Also, although the company makes about 25k profit, my accountant has said that you can't take more than your actual salary as a profit. So my question is, what's the best way to make the other £9,000 shortfall?
Okay, so at the moment, the profit of the company is £25,000, is there?
Yeah, it's about around that mark.
Okay, and have you, do you take a salary out of the company at the moment?
Yeah, that's about 9,000 only though.
Okay, that's fine. The other should be a simple solution, hopefully, is that if you're taking £9,000 out as a salary, the remaining money that you need to meet the minimum income requirement, you could take that money out as a dividend.
Yeah.
Now, if the company is making a profit of something in the region of £25,000, then I can't see a problem with the company declaring a dividend, let's say, of £10,000. Okay. So what you will then be able to do is, in addition to the £9,000 salary, which obviously we have to show for the duration of the company's financial year, in addition to the £9,000, we can add dividends of £10,000, and that will hopefully get you to £19,000, which should be enough to sponsor somebody to the United Kingdom. Yeah, I can't see a difficulty with that. Just try and make sure that you speak to the accountant and clarify that with him, but I can't see a problem with that at all.
Okay, all right, that's fine.
Brilliant.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for your call. Thank you very much. Okay, so just going back to the matters that we were discussing, we talked about English certificates, we talked about TB certificates, and we'd come on to the third sort of main document that the applicant normally has in their home country, which is the marriage certificate. And I explained how marriages have to comply with the law of the land, the law applicable in the country where the marriage takes place. Now, what I was going on to discuss was where either the applicant or the sponsor has previously been married or in a relationship. What evidence do we need to submit to prove that that relationship, that marriage has come to an end? Let's look at an easy example where there has been a relationship before, not a actual marriage, but where there's been a relationship. Now, in terms of evidence of relationship coming to an end, it's very difficult. There's no real document proving that a relationship has come to an end, because you wouldn't, because there's no real marriage there. There's no divorce certificate there. So in my experience, where they do ask for evidence that the previous long-term relationship has come to an end, how do you document or evidence that? Now, in my view, the only way that can be done is by the party who was in that relationship explaining in a document, which is normally like a declaration which is made, explaining that, look, I was in a previous relationship, there may be children from the previous relationship, but this is when the relationship came to an end and that the relationship has not resumed again. So as far as relationships are concerned, pure relationships, I think that's the way that should be dealt with. And I think that is for long-term stable relationships which have come to an end. What we normally come across is actual marriages which have taken place. So if it's an actual marriage which is recognized as a valid marriage, if it's recognized as a valid marriage in law, then that marriage, that previous marriage, whether it's the applicant who's had a previous marriage or the sponsor, that needs to be brought to an end properly and needs to be officially brought to an end and documented. So let's take a common example. Do apologize, we'll have to look at that in greater detail after we've taken our next call. We'll take our next call. Hello, assalamu alaikum.
Hello, assalamu alaikum.
Wa alaikum salam.
Hi, I just have one question, please.
Right, okay.
I want to call my husband over.
Right.
I'm actually self-employed.
Okay. Okay.
I know that I have to meet the income threshold of
Yes.
£80,600.
Yeah.
But how do I go about proving my income? Because obviously my tax returns are done at the end of the year.
I understand.
Also, somebody said that you have to provide 12 months of evidence.
Yep, right.
As opposed to 6 months.
I understand.
So is there different rules that apply to self-employment as compared to employment if I want to call my husband over?
Right. Thank you very much for that call. It's a very interesting call, and I'll deal with that in detail now. I do apologize. I'll take the next call and then deal with both together. Hello, assalamu alaikum.
Hello, wa alaikum salam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. How are you, brother?
Yeah, alhamdulillah, good. How are you? You okay?
Alhamdulillah, I'm very well.
Inshallah,
Thank you.
good.
But I just had a very quick question.
Right.
My mother-in-law and brother-in-law would like to come over for a wedding for her niece.
Okay.
From Africa,
Okay.
Tanzania.
Okay, understand.
And I would like to ask if I would like to sponsor them as a tourist visa.
I understand. Yep.
What would I need?
Okay.
Currently, I'm living in a one-bedroom flat.
Okay.
So will I be eligible to sponsor them?
I mean, it may be possible. Now, the starting point always is, do they need a financial sponsor or not? Because if they themselves have enough income and savings, then they don't normally need a financial sponsor. So that's a starting point. They may simply need a letter or invitation from here saying, look, they're coming for a wedding. Here's a wedding card that proves that a wedding's taking place. Or if it's for a birth of a child, here's the proof that somebody within the family is pregnant, like a husband, or like the wife or daughter, etc. And they're coming for that. So the starting point is, let's work out whether a financial sponsor is required or not. Because if there has to be somebody who stands as a financial sponsor, then the person in the UK would need to show that they have sufficient income and they have sufficient savings to be able to sponsor somebody. Whereas if there's no need for a financial sponsor, the person in the UK simply has to say, look, this is the reason why they're coming, and by the way, there's accommodation available at my place of residence. Now, in answer specifically to your question, if it's a one-bedroom flat, that in itself for a visitor application may not be a problem. Because if you look at a one-bedroom flat, and it probably has one living room and a separate kitchen, normally it is able to accommodate 2, 3, 4 people because there are 2 rooms there. And because it's a visitor application and not a spouse application, entry clearance officer would look at it more leniently, in that there doesn't necessarily have to be a separate bedroom for the person who's coming here for a short visit. There's no problem if they are able to use, let's say for example, you use the main bedroom, but they are able to use the living room as a temporary bedroom. It's not seen as an issue. What I would do is, if it's apparent from your tenancy documents that it's a one-bedroom flat, I would get a surveyor or a housing agent, or a estate agent, sorry, to do a report which confirms how many people are able to live at the property without the property becoming overcrowded. But I'm guessing with a one-bedroom flat which has a living room, I would think that at least about 3 to 4 people would be able to live in that property. So the bedroom in itself, the property being a one-bedroom flat in itself shouldn't present a problem to you. But going back to the first point I made, if there's a requirement for there to be a sponsor who stands as a financial sponsor, then obviously it's not simply the accommodation matter that needs to be addressed. The starting point is, do you have sufficient income and savings to be able to sponsor them in the first place? Now, hopefully, if you're working, that shouldn't in itself present a problem. A lot of the times we get asked, well, how much do you need in savings? In my experience, if it's just one person who's been sponsored, savings of about £1,000, £500, in my experience, is sufficient. The reason I say that is, once somebody comes here, let's say they are paying for their own airline tickets. If they're paying for their own airline tickets, once they come here, and let's say they're staying here for 2 weeks or 3 weeks, what is the additional cost that you're going to incur by them coming here? Well, there's not going to be any additional accommodation costs because they're living with you. There's going to be insignificant additional cost for gas, electricity. They're going to be eating with you. So it's a cost of really feeding somebody for 2 or 3 weeks, which is not more than a couple of £100 at most. So there doesn't really have to be significant amounts in savings that you need. But there has to be some level of income and there has to be some savings if you're required to stand as a financial sponsor. And on the accommodation front, even a one-bedroom flat could be enough if, looking at the property as a whole, there's enough place for the visitors to stay there without it becoming overcrowded. Hopefully that answers your question. But thank you very much for your call. Now, just returning back to the caller, just before the caller who was asking questions about the visitor application, and in particular about where somebody is sponsoring a husband or a wife, but the sponsor in the UK is self-employed. What's the position there? Because today we were looking at spouse applications, and what I was now going to come on to was to deal with how do you prove that you meet the minimum income requirement of 18,600. There are exceptions to that, and we'll discuss that in other shows. And normally we say, well, it's simple. Where somebody is, the sponsor in the UK is working, we simply need 6 months wage slips, 6 months bank statements. But what the caller was asking was whether sponsor in the UK, like the caller was, where that person is self-employed, what kind of documents need to be submitted, what's the duration of the documents that are that need to be collated and submitted. Now, in terms of the duration, let's look at that before we specifically look at what the sponsor needs to get together. Now, unlike the situation where somebody is working, where we're simply submitting 6 months of wage slips, where you've got somebody who's self-employed, it's not 6 months, it will be 12 months of documents. But the question is, which 12 months are we talking about? For somebody who isn't operating through a limited company, they are either self-employed in their own right, or they are a partner in a business, not operating a limited company. For them, the 12-month duration is the financial year, so for April to April. So somebody was making an application now. The last financial year is April 2016 to April 2017. So that would be the financial year. That's the period for which we would be collating documents. Contrast that with somebody who operates a limited company. For them, the 12-month period is the duration of the financial year for the limited company, which may well be different. But let's just concentrate now on what the caller was asking, that they are self-employed. So we've ascertained they're self-employed, and we worked out that the duration for the documents that they need to get together is April to April. If the application is being made now, we need documents from April 16 to April 17 in particular. So it's in that period that the person needs to have earned £18,600. So then we look at, well, what is it? What documents do we need? What is it that we need to submit? Now, there's a whole host of documents that we need to get together. Let's look at that. First of all, the key document that the Home Office will look at is the tax return, because the tax return actually will show how much profit has been declared for that tax year. So it'll show what the turnover was, but in particular what they're looking at is what is the declared profit on the tax return. So the tax return is the first key document that is submitted. Now, once a tax return is submitted, what you receive normally from HMRC is a breakdown of the amount of tax which is payable for that particular year. So for example, let's say there's a tax return which is submitted which shows a profit of £20,000. There is then a document which is generated which shows the amount of tax payable on that, which could be in the region of £2,000 to £3,000. So that document which shows the tax payable for that financial year has to be submitted. The third HMRC document that needs to be submitted is like a running balance. How much tax is payable, how much have you paid, what's left. So that's the third HMRC document that needs to be submitted. We've got the tax return, we've got the year's tax calculation, and like a running balance, it used to be called a statement of account, which your accountant should be able to print off for you from the HMRC portal, which will show how much was payable, how much you've paid, how much is outstanding. So they're the three key HMRC documents that need to be submitted. We'll look at the other documents as well, but you'll see that it is slightly more complicated than making an application where somebody is simply employed. Now, the next document that needs to be submitted, this is a key document which again the Home Office looks at in a great detail, is the bank statements for April to April. The reason that's looked at in greater detail is that, let's say on the tax return someone declares that they've got profits of £20,000, but their bank statements from April to April don't show that the business has that level of activity that it would generate that level of profit. So the Home Office could reject the application. So they do want to look at the bank statements for the same financial period in order to determine whether the profits which are being declared are profits based on the bank statements which the business could generate. So the bank statements are again crucial documents. Now, in addition to that, what the accountant can then produce is the financial accounts for the company. If you don't have financial accounts for the company, you can actually submit a VAT return. But in my experience, the best document to submit would be the financial accounts for the company. So, and the last document that needs to be submitted is a document which shows your unique tax reference number, the UTR number. The reason for that is that the Home Office will want to check with HMRC that you are self-employed and your tax records are in order. To be honest, the UTR number is normally on the tax return and the HMRC documents. But the key starting point is that there are certain HMRC documents, your tax return, the amount of tax payable, the further document which shows the amount of tax you've paid, what's outstanding. They're the key documents. Then the Home Office wants to look at your business bank statements for the year to determine whether the level of activity as showed in the business bank statements to confirm that it's in line with the profits you're trying to claim, and also the accounts for the business. Now, as far as the accounts is concerned, I'll make one last point before returning for the topic for the day. The accounts have to be produced by qualified accountants. So normally it has to be a chartered accountant or a chartered certified accountant or an IFA accountant, but there are only certain qualified accountants from whom the accounts, if they are produced, are acceptable to the Home Office. So that's the position with somebody who is self-employed as a sole proprietor or a partner. Now, as I said at the outset, the position with somebody who operates a limited company and the documents that need to be submitted for them, that's different, and that's something that we will hopefully look at in the coming weeks. But the good thing about the caller calling about this question is that it demonstrates how the evidence that needs to be submitted, how it's different for somebody who's employed and somebody who's self-employed. Now, I'll just briefly go back to the position which is the norm in the majority of cases, which is the document for somebody who is merely employed. Now, for them, it is relatively straightforward. It is 6 months wage slips, 6 months bank statements, and a letter from the employer confirming employment. Additional documents you can put in, such as the P60, a contract of employment, but they're not mandatory documents. The mandatory documents are your wage slips, your bank statements, and the employer's letter. But even there, it's very possible to get things wrong and run into difficulties. And unfortunately, today we don't have enough time to go through the difficulties that people run into and the pitfalls that exist, even with that simpler application. So what we will do is look at that in greater detail next week. We'll look at how the financial requirement can be met in greater detail. We'll also, as I've said, look at what happens where you are operating a limited company, but we can look at that in greater detail next week. So today we've been able to cover the key documents that the applicant has abroad, and they are those documents we've covered. We'll look at the financial matters in greater detail next week, but that does unfortunately bring us to the end of the show. Until next week, Assalamu alaikum.